Greetings everyone, thank you for joining me today. I'm doing a waterfall painting, as you can see from these samples of other works I've done. This time I wanted to do some deers in the waterfall. The waterfall will be coming in from the background. So I've got Daniel Smith paints off here on the right, as you see, and the list will be down there below in the description. I may not use all of them. I lay out my colors with a couple of empty spots for additional changes if I want to add another color. I'm using round brushes, a mop brush to just wet the background first, and most of the work will be done with a 10 round. So it's a light wet, and then I'm going to do wet on wet here with my paints. And you can see I'm using a little bit of Cobalt Blue and Quinacridone Rose. And I like how I left that little separation between the two sides there that will be my waterfall. And so I'm using some yellows to kind of make the green between Hansa Yellow and the Cobalt Blue, just sort of mixing it loosely there while it's still wet. And I am making a white groove there, kind of a pathway for that waterfall. So this first layer, once I get this in, is just to set the background a little bit. I will paint over it. And now I'm using a little burnt sienna in that same mix. This painting will be a combination of warm and cool tones. And I will have a little mixture of some autumn colored leaves with some fresh spring colors in there, like a turning of the season. A little bit of cerulean blue, just a faint glaze for the sky to take down some of that white. And then I'm using that Quinacridone Rose. You could use Quinacridone Magenta or Quinacridone Violet with a little bit of blue and burnt sienna to get that dark color. And you're going to see that dark purpley color come in and out throughout the painting. In the background, I'll also bring some of it into the foreground. Right now I'm just painting some of that negative space and allowing some of that previous dry layer to come through, because I am going to layer other colors as we go along, so you'll see. Now I'm working on the left cliff side. It will be a little bit lighter than the right hand side because the sun is coming from the right, going on to the left cliff a little more strongly, as you'll see as this develops. So I'm also leaving areas for the foliage. And one of the nice keys about painting waterfall is the less you paint the waterfall, the better it is. So I work around that area, not fussing over it too much, but rather working the foliage. And I want that waterfall to appear it's coming from the distance and then coming forward to us into the middle ground where it will pan out into the lake. A little splattering, just want to get some texture in there. And when the splatters get a little bit out of hand, like speckling in the sky, I just lift it with a paper towel. So my green is made with a little Pthalo Blue, my Hansa Yellow, and sometimes I can use a little bit of Cobalt Blue too, but if it's too bright, I dim it down with a little burnt sienna You can also use neutral tint to take some of that brightness out. And why would I take some of that brightness out? Because it's a little bit in the distance and I didn't want it to pop forward too much. Green is a color that comes forward, and red is a color that comes forward. Green is a recessive color that goes back. However, everything is relative. Green comes forward over brown. As you can see, green comes forward over the dull color in the background. So I have to temper that distance. I have to kind of modify the color values and also the brightness, because I want things in the distance to be a little bit pushed back, so not as brilliant as colors in the foreground. And you'll see what I'm referring to as it moves along. Remember, everything is relative, so what looks like a mid-tone in one part of the work may end up being a highlight later as you come in with more layers of darkness. So the idea is, as you develop the work, well, at least for me, the way it works for me is I got the whole thing in my mind, what I want to kind of develop in this. I want to be able to bring the whole thing along. And the way I do this one is I'm working from the background into the foreground. But at some point, I have to harmonize and get all these colors to work together. And you'll see what I mean as we move along in the work. I'm using a little bit of vermilion with the gold tones there. Now, when you see these greens, it's still the same combination, just a little bit more richer, less diluted. I've got the Hansa Yellow, a little bit of the Quinacridone Rose or Quinacridone Red, whatever works for you. Mixing in with some of that yellow. And it's okay if you get a little bit of orange in the green, that's okay. If you get a little bit of green in the orange, that's okay. And now I'm coming in lightly with my blues. I'm using a little bit of Pthalo Blue, watered down with a little bit of my green color. And so if you notice, the lower third of the artwork there, the painting the lower third is more of a horizontal composition, while the upper 2/3 is a vertical composition. So in order to harmonize these two ideas, you have to do it strategically. The eye wants to move up into the background to see the waterfall, but then also it comes down into the foreground. So think of it like a curve going from background to foreground. And in this way, you control the movement of the eye and how the eye is going to view and travel through the work. A lot of times in my paintings, I will make comments on composition. And so that's what I'm doing here. Now, since we do have a horizontal suggestion in the lower half of the painting, the lower third, excuse me, I don't want the eye running off to the side, because you see there's a lot of lateral horizontal lines there in the water ripples. So I've built up these rocks now, and what these rocks do is help maintain that vertical composition. The rocks are painted with burnt sienna, and some of that violet color I used for the mountains earlier, just a little hinting more towards brown. So it's Quinacridone Rose, Cobalt Blue, and burnt sienna. And I let some of that negative background color come through as highlights on the foliage. If you notice, there's a tree on the left that I've silhouetted a little bit with the bark being white, and I've painted the foliage around it. You can do that too by painting the negative space, and it has just, you know, different effects here and there. Now I have some foreground trees on the left I will address soon, but I've left that space white. I'm not sure if you know this, but different consistencies of the paint have different effects. For instance, a glaze might be considered a transparency like watered down tea. And then the next level might be a little bit thicker paint with a consistency of coffee. Another level might be called cream. I've heard of these analogies used before. Most of what you're seeing here is between coffee and cream, although initially I was using light glazes in the background, so that would be like tea. Anyway, as I build up the work, I'm going to start working on the lower half, but right now, as I build it up, I am aware that I want this foreground foliage to be in harmony with the background mountains. That's why I use very much the same color or the same color family for that, because I want to harmonize all the elements. Those reds in the background will harmonize with the deers in the foreground, and these rocks and the tree that I was working on will harmonize with the background cliffs. I'm sorry I'm off screen a little bit on this foreground tree, but I'm working with some of that same purpley brown color for its foliage. So I'm using the same color as I used for the rocks in the background, but I also am adding just this tiny bit of neutral tint. And see, as I work on this foreground tree, you will notice that it helps push or recede the background details. It pushes them back. So a little more depth of field is created here. And I'm using the side of my brush, not the tip on this. And so as I keep dabbing along, it gets to develop, and now I'm working onto the background there with the trees and the shrubs, still using some of that negative space to help define some of the details. And there's some splashes of water that I want to keep. As some of those waves come down, the water comes down the embankment there. Eventually I'll be dropping in some stones and rocks in that background, as you'll see towards the end of the video. And I let some of that green bleed into one layer into the next. I don't want to have everything defined like an illustration. I like to keep things moving, and sometimes the color will run into another color, and that's perfectly fine. As it dries, it's watercolor. We have to take advantage of its very nature to want to flow. So the right bank, the right side of the foliage, you can see is a little bit darker, as if the sun is hitting the dark, where you're seeing the shadow side of that right embankment. And then on the left side, we see more highlights. I didn't want to overemphasize the sun, but I did want to leave the suggestion that the light is coming from the right and shooting towards left. So things on the left would be highlighted from our particular perspective. So what I'm doing here is I'm working with some of the darker foliage, and if one color bleeds into the next, that's great. In fact, you can use the opposite colors to dim or to take some of the brilliance out of the brightness. So for instance, if I wanted to dim down some of that orange foliage, I would use blue or maybe green or its color opposite, you know, a cooler color, to take out some of the heat or the bright warmth of it. And the same is true with the greens. If they're too brilliant and too bright, you can always dull them with the opposite color. Now I'm doing the shadows on the dough, and I'm switching over to a softer brush, a smaller point brush. I'm using burnt sienna and a little tad, the slightest smidgen of Hansa Yellow. Not too bright. As I build this up, I'm making a shadow side and a sunny side using a small round brush. You could probably use a 6 or a 4, depending how big your particular drawing is or your painting. Now I'm using burnt sienna. And I'm building out the form. For me, having a background in drawing and anatomy of animals, I used to teach animal anatomy, wildlife drawing. Building up the form is sort of a natural for me. I think about the bones and the joints and the different angles of these masses in the body. And I do have some material out there, some videos on stuff like that, so it's a whole other discipline. But it comes in handy here. You can see about knowing the form of what it is you're actually drawing or painting. Now you see I'm using that same burnt sienna deer color for the ground, harmonizing everything. I used it on the rocks there on the right. And what that does is sort of get everything working together. So we think of not just composition, not just about where to lead the eye, but we also think about how these colors work together. And that's sort of a muddy green. Using the side of the dry brush, barely dry, to get some of that grass effect. And now I'm going into the shadows of the deer. Now, something hit me here. I thought, this is going to look so much better if I don't detail that buck too much. And I decided to put him in shadow. And it was a great idea, because what happens is, with him in shadow on half of his body, it looks like he is really there next to that rock, and that rock is just casting a great shadow across him. So it worked out really well. It was a good call. Sometimes less is more. Sometimes less detail tells more of the story. It's important here at this point that you let that shadow side of the deer dry before coming in with the midtone and highlights, or it might bleed a little too much, especially if you're looking for some solid shadows instead of suggested shadows. So now I'm harmonizing the water. I'm bringing some of the green down into the reflection from the foliage. And I'm working on that deer, more burnt sienna. It's almost all burnt sienna from here. There might be a little hint of just the slightest tad of blue to dim down the shadow side a little bit. Now he's not, the buck, which is the one turned away from us, he's not as much in the sun as the doe is. I've got her standing way out there on the bank in the sun, and he is partially shaded. And there's plane changes across the back side of that form. What I mean by a plane change is a change in direction of the body dimension. And some of my animal drawing videos cover that a little bit more when I talk about construction. So I've got some of that rock color, the deer color in there. I got some of the green, taking the background and moving it into the foreground, into some of that foreground element. And that way it harmonizes. Nothing feels like it's just glued in that spot. Everything works together in terms of its colors. Another thing I've done here is I've closed off the eye from roaming off to the left side by putting a shrub there or foliage. Excuse me. Now, as you see, it's keeping the eye where I want it to be, in the lower third of the painting, coming from above down below, so it's all working for a vertical composition and guiding the eye to know exactly where to go. The idea is you want the viewer to enjoy roaming through the artwork. You don't want it to feel contrived, like they're forced to look in a particular spot. And you can see sometimes with a one-point perspective, when people do street scenes or buildings, that eye gets forced really strongly down into the depth of that field in that one-point composition, and it's hard to pull out. It's hard to go anywhere else. So in this natural setting, I wanted to be able to suggest moving vertically and in the depth of field, but not have the viewer forced. I wanted the viewer to find his way there naturally and just enjoy the experience. So you saw me there splattering a little bit to create some texture in the dirt. Now I'm also taking some green, a very dark mossy green for the underside of the rocks there, and that kind of cools it off just a tad, but just hanging it off there. And I'm warming up those rocks a little bit more with some burnt sienna, a little bit of gold. You can use Quinacridone Gold, which is a beautiful gold, but it's so powerful and so strong, you probably want to dilute it for something like this, unless you're doing bright flowers or something. Here, this I used Hansa Yellow and burnt sienna, a little bit of gold, It just depends how I saw this thing coming along. Now I'm using a 1-point fine brush. It's a round watercolor, size 1. I'm using a little white for around the eye. I'm doing some touch-ups here. It's kind of important to know when to stop when you are truly done. And I knew I wasn't quite done with this yet. I needed to get some more color into the waters and bring them into the foreground from the background. I've taken my white and doing a few touch-ups. I came along and I decided to speckle the water. I also decided to do some white branches in the background with a twig brush. It's a very fine brush that has long, round tip, so I could get some of that foliage. And now I'm just tapping in some speckles here and there, some splashes. If the splashes got onto the foliage a little too high or on an area I didn't want, it's easy to wipe off with a slightly damp paper towel. And now I'm just sort of putting some white dabs here and there for the splash of the water with the brush. And coming in with one more light glaze for the clouds with the Cerulean Blue and a little tad of white. I didn't want it too transparent back there. We're almost done. So at some point you have to decide when it's enough. Okay, I've signed it. I'm done. I stop here. I've added a few rocks down there by the river edge. You can see that. It sort of helped guide the eye a little. And it's done. So I appreciate you joining me. I thank you. Please like and subscribe. Give me suggestions and I will be happy to do more of these. Thank you for joining me. God bless you and be safe. Have a great day. Thank you.